You've spent 18 years perfecting the art of being a ghost, Harrison, but even ghosts eventually run out of walls to haunt. I slammed the medical folder onto his mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the sterile silence of his study. Harrison didn't even flinch. He didn't look up from the financial reports he was reviewing. He simply adjusted his glasses, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. "Lower your voice, Victoria," he said, his tone as cold as a New York winter. "The help will hear you, and we both know how much you value your reputation, or what's left of it." Reputation? I let out a sharp, jagged laugh. I stopped caring about my reputation the night you walked into that studio in Soho and found me with Julian. But this isn't about my sins, Harrison. This is about yours. Finally, he looked up. His eyes, once a warm hazel, were now 2 chips of frozen flint. "I gave you a roof. I gave you the sterling name. I gave you 18 years of peace when I could have destroyed you in every tabloid from Manhattan to London. You should be thanking me." Thanking you for turning my life into a sensory deprivation tank? For treating me like a piece of furniture that happened to breathe? I leaned over the desk, my hands trembling with a rage I had suppressed for nearly 2 decades. "I stayed for Dominic, but you played God with my body, Harrison. And that is a debt you can never repay." The air in our Upper East Side penthouse has always felt heavy, but tonight it was suffocating. 18 years. That is 6,574 days of waking up next to a man who treats my existence as a clerical error. It started when I turned 42. I was a woman who felt herself becoming invisible in the shadow of Harrison's empire. Julian Vance, an artist with eyes like stormy seas, saw me. Our affair was a fever dream of paint-stained sheets in a dusty loft 25 miles away from the life I knew. Then came the night the door kicked open. Harrison hadn't screamed. He had stood there with 10-year-old Dominic clutching his hand. Harrison's reaction was far worse than rage. It was a calculated withdrawal of humanity. "We are going home," he had said to Dominic. To me, he said nothing. He didn't file for divorce. That would have cost him $120 million in the settlement and tarnished the Sterling family brand. Instead, he kept me in the house but deleted me from his life. We attended galas together, my hand resting on his tuxedo sleeve like a decorative accessory. But the moment the car door closed, the iron curtain dropped. I was a prisoner in a $25 million gilded cage. I thought I had reached the floor of my misery until this morning. A routine checkup with Dr. Alistair Thorne led to a clerical oversight. A nurse handed me an old file from a surgery I barely remembered, an emergency appendectomy I'd had 6 months after the affair ended. I opened it, expecting to see notes on a ruptured appendix. Instead, I saw a word that made my heart stop. Termination. While I was under anesthesia, Harrison had authorized the termination of a 10-week pregnancy, a child he assumed wasn't his. He had killed the only evidence of my betrayal while I slept, then watched me mourn a miscarriage he told me happened during surgery. "I saved you from the consequences of your own filth, Victoria," Harrison whispered, standing up to face me. "Did you really think I would allow a bastard to inherit the Sterling seat? If I were you, I'd burn that file. We have Dominic's charity auction tomorrow. Try to look grateful." He turned his back on me. The rage inside me, a low simmering ember for 18 years, suddenly roared into a forest fire. He thought the silence had broken me. He was wrong. The silence had filled me with sharpened steel. "The auction," I said, my voice eerily calm. "Yes." "Let's make it a night to remember, Harrison." The auction was being held at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, a venue that screamed old money and untouchable status. I sat at my vanity, staring at the woman in the mirror. At 60, I still had the bone structure that had once made me the darling of the Manhattan social scene. But my eyes looked like they had seen the bottom of an abyss. I picked up a pair of diamond earrings, a gift from Harrison for our 25th anniversary. He hadn't given them to me. He'd had his secretary leave them on my dresser with a printed note. I put them on, feeling the cold weight of the stones against my skin. They felt like tiny shackles. "Mom, are you ready?" "The car is downstairs." Dominic stood in the doorway. At 30, he was the perfect blend of Harrison's ruthless jawline and my restless spirit. He was the only reason I hadn't walked into the East River years ago. But looking at him tonight made my stomach churn. Every time I saw him, I remembered him as a 10-year-old boy in that Soho loft, seeing his mother shattered. Harrison had used our son as a shield and a weapon, ensuring Dominic grew up seeing me as the fragile, unwell parent who needed to be managed, while Harrison was the stoic savior. "I'm ready, Dom," I said, forced a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "You look handsome. That suit must have cost more than my first car." "Details, Mom," he chuckled, offering his arm. "Harrison is already in the car. He's in a mood. Business, I guess." "No, not business," I thought. "He's just waiting for me to break." The ride to the museum was a masterclass in psychological torture. Harrison sat to my right, his gaze fixed on his phone. The silence between us so thick it was a third passenger. Dominic sat opposite us, chatting about the $200,000 opening bid for the centerpiece painting, a landscape by a rising star. My mind, however, was 25 miles away and 18 years in the past. I remembered the smell of Julian's loft, linseed oil, cheap cigarettes, and the scent of rain on hot pavement. Julian Vance hadn't been a businessman. He was a storm. When I was with him, I wasn't Mrs. Harrison Sterling, the hostess of charity galas. I was Victoria, a woman who felt the blood rushing through her veins. We had met at a gallery opening in Chelsea. I was 42, bored, and feeling the first real tremors of a midlife crisis. Harrison was obsessed with a merger that would eventually net him $500 million, leaving me to dine with shadows. Julian had walked up to me, looked at the wine glass in my hand, and said, "You're holding that like it's a poison you're forced to drink." 3 weeks later, I was in his bed. I knew it was wrong. I knew the risks. But for the first time in a decade, someone looked at me without calculating my value to a brand. Julian didn't care about the sterlings. He cared about the curve of my shoulder and the way I laughed when I was nervous. The night of the event, the night that ended my life, had been unusually humid. Julian was painting me. I was draped in a silk sheet, feeling more exposed and alive than ever. We didn't hear the door. Harrison must have bribed the building manager. The memory of the door crashing open still played in my head in slow motion. Harrison stood there, not in a fit of rage, but with a terrifying, clinical stillness. And Dominic. Oh, God, Dominic. He was clutching a baseball glove. They had been on their way back from a game. Harrison had brought him there on purpose. He wanted the boy to see the filth. "Victoria," Harrison had said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "Dress yourself. We have a dinner engagement." That was it. No screaming. No physical confrontation with Julian. just a cold command that stripped me of every ounce of dignity. "Mom, we're here!" Dominic's voice snapped me back to the present. The car door opened, and the flashes of the paparazzi blinded me. Harrison stepped out first, then reached back to take my hand. His grip was firm, his fingers digging into my palm just a little too hard, a reminder of who owned whom. "Smile, Victoria," he whispered as we stepped onto the red carpet. "You're the star of the show tonight." I looked at the cameras, the flashing lights, and the sea of elite vultures waiting for a crack in the sterling armor. I leaned into Harrison, my lips inches from his ear. "You're right, Harrison. I am the star, and by the end of this night, I'm going to make sure everyone remembers my name." I felt him stiffen. The game had changed. He thought he was leading me to a social event. The great hall of the Met was a cathedral of ego. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears over a crowd that controlled half of Wall Street. As we moved through the room, I felt the familiar weight of 1,000 eyes. To them, we were the gold standard of Manhattan stability. To me, every handshake was a lie. "Victoria, darling, you look radiant. Is that a vintage McQueen?" Eleanor Wentworth, a woman whose face had been pulled so tight by surgeons she could barely blink, fluttered toward us. Before I could answer, Harrison's hand found the small of my back, a gesture of affection to the public, but to me, it felt like the cold barrel of a gun. "She's the centerpiece of my life, Eleanor," Harrison said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon. "Everything else is just set dressing." The irony was so sharp, I almost choked on my champagne. I looked at Harrison, his profile regal and unbothered, and then I looked at Dr. Alastair Thorne standing by the bar. The doctor caught my eye and immediately looked away, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He knew. He knew I had seen the file. "Excuse me, Eleanor," I said, my voice cutting through Harrison's charm. "I need a word with our doctor." I felt Harrison's grip tighten, his fingers biting into my skin through the silk of my dress. "Not now, Victoria. We have a schedule." "The schedule can wait, Harrison. My health cannot," I hissed, wrenching myself away from him. The sudden movement caused a few heads to turn. Harrison's mask flickered for a split second, a flash of pure, murderous irritation, before he smoothed it over with a practiced chuckle. I cornered Alastair near the Egyptian wing, where the stone sphinxes felt more human than the people in the hall. "Victoria, this isn't the place," Alastair whispered, his hands trembling as he set his drink down. 18 years, Alastair," I said, stepping into his personal space. "I was no longer the submissive wife. I was a predator. You performed a surgical termination on me without my consent. You told me it was a complication from an appendectomy. That's medical malpractice. That's a criminal conspiracy. Did Harrison pay you, or did he just threaten to pull his $10 million donation from your research wing?" He told me it was what you wanted," Alistair stammered, his eyes darting around the room. "He said you were too distraught to sign the papers, that you had begged him to handle it. He's your husband, Victoria. He had power of attorney during the emergency." "I was unconscious," I low growled, my face inches from his. "I never begged for that. I didn't even know I was pregnant until I read that file this morning. You helped him kill my child to protect his inheritance." "It would have destroyed the family, Victoria," he pleaded. "Think of Dominic." "Do not use my son's name to justify your cowardice," I snapped. "You have two choices, Alastair. You can give me the original, unedited records, the ones Harrison thinks you destroyed, or I will make sure the medical board is the least of your worries. I'll go to the New York Times before the auction ends." I'll get them to you," he whimpered. "Just don't make a scene here." I left him shaking and walked back toward the main stage, where the auction was about to begin. I saw Dominic standing near the podium, looking proud of the money he was raising for family values. The hypocrisy was a physical weight in my chest. I felt a presence behind me. Harrison. He didn't say a word, but the air around him crackled with tension. "Whatever you think you're doing, Victoria, stop," he whispered, his voice a lethal thread of sound. "I've spent 18 years keeping your world intact. I can take it all away in 18 minutes. You already took everything that mattered 18 years ago, Harrison," I replied, looking straight ahead at the auctioneer. "I'm just here to settle the bill." The auctioneer cleared his throat, his voice booming through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We move now to our keynote item, a rare private collection piece." I checked my phone. A text from an unknown number. "Alistair, check your email. It's all there. Leave me out of the rest." I looked at Harrison and smiled. It was the first real smile I had given him in nearly 2 decades. It was the smile of a woman who had just found the detonator. "Shall we take our seats, darling?" I asked. I wouldn't want to miss a single moment of this. The auctioneer's gavel struck the podium, a rhythmic thud that sounded to me like the beating of a dying heart. We took our seats in the front row, the sterling row. Harrison sat to my left, the image of a titan of industry. Dominic sat to my right, his face glowing with the naive pride of a man who believed his family was a fortress of virtue. "You're quiet," Dominic whispered, leaning toward me. "Are you okay, Mom? You look different tonight." "I've never felt clearer, Dom," I said, patting his hand. My heart ached for him. He was 30 years old, yet he was still the most fragile thing in this room, built on a foundation of Harrison's lies. The bidding for a rare $150,000 sculpture began, but I wasn't listening. I was staring at the digital screen behind the auctioneer, imagining my own private collection being displayed there. I reached into my clutch and felt the cold metal of my phone. The email from Dr. Thorne was sitting there, a digital bomb containing the signed authorization forms for my procedure. Harrison's signature was bold, arrogant, dated just hours after I was admitted to the hospital 18 years ago. Beside it was something even more damning, a blood type compatibility report from that same night. I felt Harrison's gaze on me. He wasn't watching the auction. He was watching my hands. He knew I had cornered Thorne. "Whatever Alistair told you is the rambling of an old man who has had too much scotch," Harrison murmured, his lips barely moving as he stared straight ahead. "Don't ruin your son's night for a grudge that belongs in the past." "A grudge?" I turned my head slightly, my eyes burning into his profile. "You stole my choice, Harrison. You butchered my body while I was unconscious to save your ego. That isn't a grudge. That's a war crime. I did what was necessary to preserve our legacy," he hissed, finally looking at me. For a second, the mask slipped, revealing the terrifying void beneath. "Look at Dominic. Look at his life. Would you trade his happiness for a child born of a Soho gutter?" "That wasn't your call to make!" My voice rose just enough for the couple in the second row to glance our way. Harrison's hand clamped onto my wrist under the table. His grip was bruising. "I am the one who kept you out of the gutter, Victoria. I paid Julian $250,000 to disappear. I bought his silence and his absence. I owned your mistake, and I erased it. You will sit here, you will smile, and you will be the wife I paid for." I felt a chill wash over me. Julian hadn't left me because he stopped loving me. He had been bought. Harrison hadn't just punished me with silence. He had systematically dismantled every exit I might have had, leaving me with nothing but his cold shadow. $300,000! Going once, going twice! The auctioneer shouted. You think money is the only currency that matters, Harrison? I whispered, leaning in so close I could see the tiny burst capillaries in his eyes. But you've forgotten about the truth. The truth is free, and it's about to get very loud in here. I pulled my arm back, the red marks of his fingers already blooming on my skin. I didn't care about the pain. I felt a strange, intoxicating sense of power. For 18 years, I had been the victim of his silence. Tonight, the silence was mine to break. Dominic stood up to take the microphone, ready to give his speech about legacy and responsibility. The crowd erupted in applause. He looked so much like Harrison in that moment. The same posture, the same authoritative air. Thank you all for being here, Dominic began, his voice echoing through the Egyptian wing. My father always taught me that a legacy isn't just about wealth. It's about the truth of who we are and the strength of the bonds we keep. I looked at Harrison. He was watching Dominic with a smirk of satisfaction. He thought he had won. He thought the $25 million penthouse and the Sterling name were enough to bury the rot. I opened my phone and began drafting an email to the entire board of the Sterling Foundation, including the press contacts I had cultivated over decades. I attached the files from Dr. Thorne. My thumb hovered over the send button. Mom! Dominic looked toward our table, gesturing for me to join him on stage. I'd like my mother to say a few words. She's been the quiet strength of this family for as long as I can remember. The spotlight swung toward me, blinding and hot. Harrison's face turned pale. He knew I had the power to end it all right there, in front of the cameras and the elite of New York. Go on, Victoria, Harrison whispered, his voice trembling with a rare thread of fear. Be the quiet strength. Don't destroy him. I stood up, smoothing my dress. I wasn't thinking about the money or the scandal. I was thinking about the 18 years of cold nights and the child I never got to hold. Oh, I'm done being quiet, Harrison, I said, loud enough for only him to hear. I walked toward the stage, each step feeling lighter than the last. I wasn't just walking toward a microphone. I was walking toward the end of my life as a ghost. The spotlight felt like an interrogation lamp. I stood on the stage next to Dominic, the air in the Egyptian wing suddenly turning thin. Harrison was a silhouette in the front row, his eyes two dark voids watching my every move. Mom? Dominic whispered, handing me the microphone. He noticed my hand shaking, his brow furrowing in concern. Are you okay? I looked out at the sea of faces, the elite, the powerful, the vultures in tuxedos. The urge to detonate the bomb in my phone right now was overwhelming. But looking at Dominic's trusting face, I hesitated. If I destroyed Harrison here, I destroyed Dominic too. Thank you, Dominic, I said, my voice steadier than expected. Your father always says a legacy is built on what we leave behind, but sometimes it's about what we choose to face. I looked directly at Harrison. He didn't blink. I handed the mic back and walked off, heading for a side gallery filled with ancient Roman busts, stony faces that had witnessed the fall of empires. I leaned against a cold marble pillar and opened the second attachment Dr. Thorne had sent. In my haste earlier, I had only seen the word termination. Now I looked at the lab results from 18 years ago. My breath hitched. The blood type of the fetus was O negative. I am type A. Julian Vance, as I remembered from his military records, was type B. A and B cannot produce an O. But Harrison was O negative. The child hadn't been Julian's. It had been Harrison's. The room began to spin. Harrison hadn't killed a bastard to protect his legacy. He had killed his own child just to punish me. He had allowed me to believe I was carrying the evidence of my betrayal, using that guilt to chain me to him for 18 years, all while knowing he was the father. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Victoria. I froze. Harrison was standing at the entrance, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He stepped into the light, looking perfectly composed. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked, his voice a low, terrifying purr. It was yours, I whispered. The baby was yours, Harrison. Why? Harrison walked toward me, his movements slow and predatory. Because you broke the contract, Victoria. The moment you stepped into that loft, you ceased to be my wife. I didn't want anything from you. Not even a child that carried my blood, if it was tainted by your need to feel alive. You're a monster, I gasped. You killed your own child to spite me? I removed a complication, he said, stopping inches from my face. I gave you 18 years to repent. Now, you will delete those files. If you don't, I'll tell Dominic his mother is a woman who tried to ruin his father over a lie. In this city, the truth is whatever I pay for it to be. He reached out, his hand wrapping around my throat, not to choke me, but to assert dominance. But Harrison had made one mistake. He thought I was still terrified of losing my status. I pushed his hand away. The truth is expensive, Harrison, I whispered. And I'm finally ready to spend every cent. I walked past him, but a new, darker thought struck me. If Harrison was this meticulous about purity, what else had he lied about? My mind flashed back 30 years to a night in the Hamptons when Harrison had been away, and I had been comforted by his best friend. I realized I needed one more test, and this time, I wouldn't be asking for permission. The gala continued in the other room, a muffled roar of laughter and clinking crystal that felt a world away. I stood in the shadows of the Roman gallery, watching Harrison walk back toward the light. He moved with the effortless grace of a man who believed he had just quelled a minor rebellion. I looked down at my phone. The lab report was still there, glowing like a brand. Harrison had killed his own child. He had let me mourn a miscarriage while he watched me with that cold, judgmental silence, savoring the fact that I was crying over a death he had orchestrated. The depravity of it made my skin crawl. But as the shock began to subside, a cold, analytical clarity took its place. Harrison was a man who obsessed over purity and lineage. He had ended a pregnancy because it was tainted by the timing of my affair. If he is that obsessed with bloodlines, I thought, how did he react 30 years ago? In the late 90s, our marriage had hit its first dry spell. Harrison was in London for 3 weeks, closing a deal that would put the Sterling name on the global map. I was alone in our Hamptons estate, a sprawling, lonely fortress of glass and salt air. Harrison's business partner and best friend at the time was Marcus Thorne, Alistair's younger brother. Marcus was everything Harrison wasn't: empathetic, present, and deeply observant. One night, after too much wine and too much loneliness, the lines blurred. It was a one-time mistake, a momentary lapse that I had buried under layers of guilt for 3 decades. Dominic was born 9 months later. Harrison had celebrated. He had paraded Dominic around like a trophy. I had always assumed that since Harrison never said anything, the timing must have lined up perfectly with his return from London. But standing here now, knowing Harrison's capacity for clinical cruelty, a terrifying question took root. Did Harrison really believe Dominic was his? Or was Dominic the first mess he had decided to manage? I needed a sample. I walked back into the main hall, my face a mask of socialite perfection. I spotted Dominic at the bar, laughing with a group of young investors. He was holding a Scotch glass, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the side. "Dom," I said, sliding in beside him. "Mom." "There you are. Harrison said you had a bit of a dizzy spell. Are you okay?" He reached out, his hand steady and warm on my arm. He was so good, so untainted by the rot surrounding him. "I'm fine, darling. Just the heat." I lied. I reached for his glass. "Is that the 18-year-old Macallan? Let me have a sip." "Since when do you drink scotch, Mom?" He handed it to me with a grin. I took a small sip, the liquid burning my throat. Then I tucked the glass into my clutch, shielded by my pashmina. "I think I'll take this for a walk. I need some air. I'll meet you at the car in 20 minutes. "Sure thing. Don't let Dad see you stealing the good stuff," he joked. I hurried toward the ladies' room. I didn't need much. The saliva on the rim of the glass and a stray hair I'd plucked from his jacket earlier when we hugged would be enough for a private lab I knew in Jersey, one that didn't ask questions if the check was large enough. As I exited the bathroom, I ran into Harrison. He was waiting for me in the corridor, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. "You're being very active tonight, Victoria," he said, his eyes scanning my clutch. "Collecting souvenirs?" "Just memories, Harrison," I replied, my voice hard. "I want to make sure I remember every detail of the night you lost everything." "You're delusional," he whispered, stepping closer. "You have no money of your own. Your friends are my friends. Your son believes I am a saint. You are an aging woman with a disgraced past. Go to the car. We are leaving." "You're right about one thing," I said, stepping around him. "Dominic does believe you're a saint. I wonder how he'll feel when he finds out you're a child killer." Harrison's face didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten, a microscopic fracture in his armor. I walked out of the museum and into the cool night air. I didn't wait for the Sterling limo. I hailed a yellow cab, the first time I had been in one in years. "Where to, lady?" the driver asked. "New Jersey," I said. "And drive fast. I have 30 years of lies to catch up with." As the cab sped away from the museum, I looked back at the grand stone building. Harrison was standing on the steps, a small, dark figure under the massive arches. He thought he was the architect of my agony. He didn't realize I was about to pull the foundation right out from under his feet. The lab in Fort Lee was a stark, clinical purgatory, a world away from the velvet-lined corridors of the Upper East Side. It was tucked into a nondescript brick building where the humming of the air filtration system sounded like a low, persistent growl. I handed over the Scotch glass, still bearing the faint, ghostly rim of Dominic's saliva, and the hair sample I had meticulously retrieved from his blazer. I didn't care about the $15,000 cash I had to slide across the counter to bypass the standard waiting period. This was money I had siphoned from the household accounts over 5 years, a freedom fund I'd kept hidden for a day I never thought would actually come. I had saved it for an escape. I hadn't realized I would be using it to buy the truth. I need the results before the sun is up, I told the technician. My voice was a brittle shard of ice. He didn't look at my designer dress or the dark circles under my eyes. He just took the money and the samples. I spent the next few hours in a 24-hour diner across the street. The coffee was bitter, tasting of burnt beans and desperation. My phone remained eerily silent. Harrison hadn't called. No, where are you? No threats. He likely thought he had broken me at the museum, assuming I had retreated to a hotel to drown my sorrows in gin and regret. At 4:45 a.m., the ping of an email notification shattered the stillness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened the encrypted PDF. I bypassed the rows of genetic markers and technical jargon, scrolling straight to the bottom. My eyes locked onto the only words that mattered. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. The world didn't spin. It became terrifyingly crystal clear. Dominic, the golden heir the boy Harrison had used as a moral cudgel to beat me into submission for 18 years, was not a Sterling. He was Marcus Thorne's son. I let out a sound that started as a sob and morphed into a jagged, hysterical laugh. Harrison had spent 30 years grooming a successor who didn't carry a single drop of his blood. He had killed his actual biological child 18 years ago because he suspected it was a bastard, all while unknowingly, or so I thought, raising another man's child as the prince of his empire. But then, a darker realization took root. Harrison was a man who audited every soul in his orbit. If he had been meticulous enough to check the blood type of the fetus he had aborted in my unconscious body, he would have checked Dominic's blood the moment he was born. Harrison knew. He had known for 3 decades. He had kept the secret not out of love, but to preserve the Sterling brand. He had allowed me to live in a prison of guilt, watching me mourn a child he killed, while he sat on a throne of lies even larger than my own. I hailed a cab back to Manhattan. I arrived at the Penthouse at 6:15 a.m. and walked straight into Harrison's master suite. He was sitting in an armchair by the window, staring out at the gray light of dawn. "I found the missing piece, Harrison," I said, dropping the lab report onto his lap. He didn't flinch. He didn't even look at the paper. "I've known since he was 3 days old," he whispered. I felt like he had reached into my chest and squeezed my heart. "You knew? You made me live in 18 years of frozen silence for a 1-month affair while you were living a 30-year lie?" Harrison finally looked at me, his face a hollowed-out ruin. "I didn't do it for you. I did it for the name. Dominic is my masterpiece, Victoria. Even if he carries Marcus's DNA, he is my creation. He is the Sterling legacy." "You're a sociopath," I breathed, my hand trembling as I reached for my phone. "I'm calling Marcus, and then I'm telling Dominic everything." Harrison's eyes widened, a flicker of raw terror crossing his face. "You wouldn't. It would kill him. You'd destroy your own son just to hurt me?" "I'm not hurting him, Harrison," I said, my finger hovering over the dial. "I'm freeing him from a ghost." The sun was fully up now, bleeding a harsh, unforgiving light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the master suite. Harrison looked ancient. For the first time in my life, the man who had loomed over me like a titan looked like a pile of gray ash, waiting for a breeze to scatter him. "You won't do it," Harrison said, his voice fraying at the edges. "Think about the fallout, Victoria. The Sterling Foundation, the offshore accounts, they'll tear Dominic apart. He'll go from the Prince of New York to a tabloid punchline." "You still think this is about the money?" I said, my voice eerily calm. You think everyone is as hollow as you are. Dominic doesn't care about your board members. He cares about the truth. The one thing you've starved him of for 30 years. I didn't call Dominic first. I called Marcus Thorne. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice thick with sleep. I'm standing in Harrison's bedroom, Marcus, I said. I have a DNA report that says Dominic is your son, and Harrison just admitted he's known since the birth, so... The silence on the other end was deafening. Victoria, Marcus whispered. I didn't know. He showed me forged papers. He threatened to ruin me if I ever approached you. I thought I was protecting you by staying away. I hung up and turned to Harrison. He's coming over, and so is Dominic. For the first time in this house, no one is allowed to be silent. You're destroying everything, Harrison hissed, grabbing my shoulders. I gave you 18 years of safety. Safety? I wrenched myself away, my rage finally exploding. I grabbed a crystal vase and hurled it at the wall. It shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. You kept me in a tomb. You watched me cry for a child you murdered. You let me believe I was the only failure while you failed every test of humanity. The door swung open. Dominic stood there, his face pale with horror. Mom? Dad, what's going on? I heard something about Marcus. Harrison tried to wear his mask of concern. Dominic, son, your mother is having a breakdown. Stop it, Harrison, I barked. I handed Dominic the DNA report and the medical file. Read these, Dom. I won't let you live another day in this man's shadow without knowing who you are. Dominic's eyes scanned the lines. I watched the moment his world collapsed. He's not my father? He whispered. I raised you, Harrison shouted. I am the only father you know. You gave me a lie, Dominic roared, throwing the papers back. You let me love you while you were hiding this? The doorbell rang. Marcus had arrived. The fortress was gone, and for the first time in 18 years, I could finally breathe. The foyer of the Penthouse felt like a courtroom where the laws of gravity had ceased to apply. Marcus Thorne stood by the private elevator, his eyes fixed on Dominic with a mixture of terror and a 30-year-old grief. Dominic didn't move. He stood in the center of the room, the DNA results crumpled in his fist like a spent grenade. Harrison, meanwhile, had retreated into the shadows of the hallway, leaning against a cold marble bust of a Roman emperor. He was trying to regain his composure, trying to litigate his way out of a reality that had finally outpaced him. Dominic, Marcus began, his voice trembling. I swear to you, I didn't know. Harrison showed me a lab report. He made me believe the timing was impossible. He threatened to erase me if I ever approached you. He made everyone believe exactly what he wanted. I interrupted, stepping forward. I felt a sharp, cold clarity I hadn't known in decades. He's been the director of this play for 30 years, and we were all just actors following a script we didn't know we'd signed on to. But the curtain just came down, Harrison, and the audience is leaving. Dominic turned to Harrison, ignoring Marcus for a moment. His eyes were vibrating with a dangerous intensity. The night you took me to that loft in Soho, when I was 10, you didn't take me there to see the truth about Mom. You took me there to ensure I'd never trust her again. You used a 10-year-old boy to bury your own insecurities because you knew I wasn't yours, and you couldn't stand us being a team against you. Harrison didn't answer. He just tightened his jaw, the silence he had used as a weapon for 18 years now serving as a paper shield.
And the baby?
Dominic's voice cracked as he held up the medical file.
The one from 18 years ago. My sibling.
You killed them because you couldn't own them? Is that the Sterling way? If you can't own it, you destroy it?
It was a complication, Dominic,
Harrison said, his voice regaining a sliver of its oily sheen.
It was for the best. The Sterling legacy required— Stop saying that word!
Dominic roared, the sound shattering the house's hollow dignity.
There is no legacy!
There is just a penthouse filled with lies and a man so obsessed with his name that he'd murder his own blood to protect it. You aren't a titan, Harrison. You're a ghost in an expensive suit. Dominic turned back to me, his rage softening into heartbreak. Mom, why did you stay? Why did you let him do this to us? Because I thought I was alone, Dom, I said, touching his face. He told me he'd make sure you hated me forever. I stayed because I couldn't live in a world where you looked at me the way he wanted you to. I don't hate you, Dominic whispered, pulling me into a hug that felt like the first real breath I'd taken in decades. I hate the air in this house. Dominic looked at Harrison one last time with pure pity. You're going to be very famous, Harrison. Mom and I are leaving, and by noon, the board is going to have questions about the hush money you paid Dr.
Thorne.
Harrison's face finally broke. Dominic, wait. We can talk about this. Your inheritance.
Keep your money, Harrison,
Dominic said, walking toward the elevator.
I'd rather be a punchline than a Sterling.
I turned to Harrison, who was reaching out a trembling hand. You gave me a cage, Harrison. I'm just leaving you the keys so you can sit in it alone until the walls come down. I walked out with my son, the weight of the Sterling name falling away like dead skin. But as we hit the lobby, my phone buzzed. A silent alarm had been triggered in Harrison's study. The silent alarm on my phone was the final, desperate gasp of a dying empire. I stared at the pulsing notification as the elevator descended. Harrison was likely in his study, perhaps shredding the physical remnants of his forgeries, or realizing that even his state-of-the-art security could no longer contain the truth.
Mom, what is it?
Dominic asked, his hand on the brass handle of the building's exit. Nothing, Dom, I said, sliding the phone into my clutch. Just a ghost rattling its chains. Let it haunt itself. We stepped out onto Park Avenue. The morning air was crisp and biting, smelling of fresh rain and the city's indifferent energy. For the first time in 18 years, the sun didn't feel like an interrogation lamp. It felt like a witness. I had already taken the final step. While Dominic was confronting Harrison, I had pressed send on an email drafted in the back seat of a cab at dawn. The medical records, the DNA results, and the ledger of Harrison's donations to Dr. Thorne were now in the inboxes of the New York Times and the Sterling Foundation's board. By the time Harrison had his morning coffee, his carefully curated world would be under a surgical microscope. "Where are we going?" Dominic asked. He looked untethered, a man whose history had been rewritten in a single sunrise. "To my sister's in Vermont," I said, hailing a yellow cab. "And then, wherever we want. I have a freedom fund that will keep us moving until the lawyers sort out the wreckage."
He'll fight us,
Dominic noted, looking back at the penthouse. "He'll spend millions to make us the villains." "Let him try," I replied, a cold smile touching my lips. He used silence as a cage, believing it would keep us forever. He doesn't realize that once you find your voice, no amount of money can buy it back. As we climbed into the cab, my phone buzzed. It was Marcus. I swiped it away. He was a part of the past, a victim, yes, but also a man who chose safety over the truth. Dominic would deal with him in his own time. The cab pulled away, and I watched the Sterling building shrink until it was just another gray tooth in the skyline. I thought about the child I lost 18 years ago. My anger wasn't just for me anymore. It was for them. It was for the woman I used to be, who thought she deserved to be punished. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The silence was still there, but it was light. It was the quiet of a clean slate. "You okay, Mom?" Dominic reached over, taking my hand. "I'm more than okay, Dom," I whispered. "I'm finally free." The cab crossed the bridge, leaving the gilded cage behind. The war was over, and as the city vanished into the mist, I realized I hadn't just survived Harrison Sterling. I had outlived him. Truth is the only way to be free. So don't let anyone use your past or their money to lock you in a gilded cage. If a life feels suffocating, have the courage to walk away and finally breathe for yourself. Thank you so much for listening to this journey until the very end. If the story touched your heart, please hit like, leave a comment below, and stay tuned for more gripping stories coming your way.